The next article we'll look at is Article 1463 of the Civil Code, which you can see these numbers are pretty close together. They're all in the same section. So a couple of articles after the last one that talked about parents and kids, you see this article. And we'll need to decipher this a little bit. It says, the principal is bound to make reparation for injury caused by the fault of his agents and servants in the performance of their duties. Nevertheless, he retains his remedies against them. Okay, let's decipher what this means. The principal isn't like the principal of the school. We're not talking about servants in the sense of, I don't know, we're not talking about slaves or anything like this. Let's change the language here. We'll take the same article, change the language a little bit. Really, what we're talking about here is the boss is bound to pay for injury caused by the screw-ups of his employees while they're on the job. The boss can still try to sue the employees later to get his money back. All right, what's going on here? This is the old language, right? This is what shows up in the actual code, and this is my kind of vulgarized translation of it. The boss is bound to pay for injury caused by screw-ups of his employees while they're on the job. The boss can still try to sue them later to get his money back. What this means is, normally employees, if they do something, like let's say you've got a contract with some company, and the employee does something really stupid, and it ends up injuring you. Well, the problem is that the employee, they might be somebody who doesn't actually have any wages. It may not make any sense to sue them because they don't have a lot that you can actually try and use to compensate it. Right? It could be that all the money they have in the world is $10,000, and your injury is $300,000, and you're saying, well, this really is terrible. So what this law says is that you can also sue the company. You can sue the boss. You can sue the company and have the company pay for what the employee did. And there are a few limits on this, right? You do still have to be able to show that what the employee did was faulty. You have to show that this person really was an employee in the sense that they mean an agent or a servant, somebody acting on the instruction of the company. And you also have to show that it's in the exercise of their duties. This is often where these cases get sticky. It's while the person was on the job. Now, this last bit isn't really what we're going to focus on so much. It just means that if you do sue the company and they end up having to pay for your loss, then later on the company can also try and recover the money from the employee. Typically, what's going to happen is if you're suing the company because the employee doesn't have any money, then probably the company is going to waste its time trying to sue the employee either. They'll probably just fire them. Okay, so I mentioned at this point about it has to be about what they've done while on the job, right? The idea is, yeah, you can sue the company for what the employee did, but only if the employee is really being an employee at the time. Okay, if it's something they did, they happen to work for you, and then they do something when they're, just not really working for you, just kind of happen to be wearing the uniform you have them wear, that's not really the same thing, right? Let's look at some examples to try and make sense of this. This is actually an American example, so it doesn't, the CCQ, the Civil Code of Quebec, doesn't apply here, but the same principles do apply. This is really very parallel in the way that they apply it here. So this is a real case. The story was that you had a guy who was in the U.S. Navy, and his boat was in dry dock in a major port in the U.S. Dry dock is just where they put ships in order to be repaired. And because his ship was there, he was still sleeping on the ship. Actually, I don't think his boat was in dry dock, but it was right next to the dry dock. They were locked up near the dry dock. And he was on shore leave. You could say, let's pretend that this over here is where his Navy ship was, out in the water. And they were parked in port, but, people in the Navy can sometimes get a little excited when they've got shore leave because they can be out at sea for months and months and months. And then when they're locked in port, there's all these stories about the way sailors tend to act. So he went into town, had himself a grand old time, got very drunk, and then on his way back to get to his own boat, he passed by the dry docks, which is where, again, you have a large ship being repaired. And he thought it'd be really funny to just open the faucets to hold the water back. So you see all out here, this is water. The water, as he's staggering back to his boat, the water is slowly filling up this big hole where you've got a broken ship that's hull is being repaired. And the water coming in here causes millions and millions of dollars of damage. Because the ship isn't in a state where it can really handle water. That's why it's being repaired. And so this guy probably doesn't even notice anything bad is happening. He goes into his bunk, goes to sleep, wakes up the next day. Everybody's very angry about what's happened. And so the guy who owns the dry dock wants to sue the midshipmen, but he also wants to sue the Navy. That's why this is the case versus the USA. He was actually suing the government, suing the Navy. And the question here is, it's clear, all right, doing this was faulty. Opening up the water was faulty. It caused injury to the guy who owned the dock. But the question is, was this guy, the drunken Navy guy who staggers back to his boat, was he acting in the course of his duties? He definitely was in the Navy. He was in uniform at the time. He was heading back to the boat where he lived, and he lived on that boat only because of his obligations to the Navy. In this case, ultimately, the Navy was not held liable because the judge said, look, I know this really sucks, but under the circumstances, this guy wasn't acting as a member of the Navy. Even if he was in uniform, it was not in the course of his duties. The boss, the company, in this case the U.S., the Navy, is only responsible for damage caused by the injury of its employees when they're acting as their employees. Right? It'd be different if he were driving around a little Navy skiff that came off the side and he was on a little mission from the Navy and he smashed in, made a hole here. That would be different. But he was on break, right? He was not acting as a Navy man at the time. Here's another example. This is from closer to home. This is a case in Quebec, Havre des Femmes contre Dubé. This is a pretty awful case. This is a women's shelter where there was a guy who worked at the women's shelter, and he knew that one of the residents at the women's shelter was particularly vulnerable to her alcohol addiction, and she was in this place to try and deal with her problems. She was trying to find a safe place to sort herself out. And so he figured out, well, this could be a way to maybe get her to come to my place. So he lured her out of the shelter to stay at his personal home in exchange for alcohol, with a consequent very sad situation that resulted for her, substantial monetary damages that we won't go into. The question was, should the women's shelter be held liable for the actions of the guy, of the employee? And you see the answer here that the women's shelter was not held liable. Okay, and what the court looked at here was they said, obviously this guy is an awful guy. He can be sued. But the women's shelter, even though he was working for them at the time, the thing he was doing, the way he was acting, was not in the scope of his duties. It wasn't his job to be luring people out of the shelter during his off hours, right? And they also looked at the fact the women's shelter was not negligent in their hiring practice. They actually took all the appropriate measures to screen out this kind of guy. They didn't succeed here, but they took reasonable efforts to try and avoid hiring anyone who would cause this sort of damage to any of their clients. And so because of that, the women's shelter was not held liable. It was not in the scope of his duties, and they were off the hook.